Hi, Rob. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience and tell them why you're here?
Yes, certainly. Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Hirschfeld. I am here at OpenStack to talk about Kubernetes, as I often do. And I've been involved in the community since its inception, so I'm an old-timer from an OpenStack perspective. I always love to come in, see what's happening, and talk to people in the community.
So I'm really curious to hear not just what you have to say about containerization, but orchestration in particular. And I'm not anything of an expert in that, so I'm going to let you lead that conversation and maybe ask you some questions about it that I might have while you're explaining.
That sounds like a good idea. So orchestration, wow, there's layers in this problem, because there's really things, scheduling, workflow, and orchestration are actually distinct things. And so it's important for people to understand what's going on. In a lot of cases, something like Kubernetes is really more of a scheduler than an orchestrator, meaning that it is able to decide where to place resources and where to use. So if I have a container and I want it to run, Kubernetes will schedule that container to run on one or more nodes based on metadata that I give it. It won't necessarily, it will a little bit, but it won't necessarily coordinate this container comes up and then that container comes up, and then when those things happen, I then change to another state. So that type of orchestration, and these are all fuzzy topics, but that type of orchestration is something that you would look at Terraform, which we find is a very popular tool that builds a whole cluster and takes a whole sequence of actions. So that ends up being more orchestration. And people get into big fights about these things. So
what would technology be if people weren't getting into big fights about it? Because it's so philosophical, especially in open source.
Right. And to round things out, workflow for us, and the work we do with our open source project Digital Rebar, workflow is when you take a single node or a single stream of action and then you drive it through a series of stages. So workflow is a much simpler component for that. So, and you mix all these things together.
And I'm curious because a few OpenStack summits ago, Docker, which is good. We love Docker.
We used to love Docker.
Well, we used to love them. So can you give me your take on Docker / Kubernetes / what's going on?
Wow.
To be specific.
So Docker is very confusing because there's a company called Docker and there's a technology called Docker. And a couple of years ago, everybody was very excited because Docker, the company and the technology, had created a way that made it very easy to take some existing technologies, package them together, and then distribute code in a very consistent, repeatable way, which is a big win, right? Instead of having to deploy and build a whole VM with all sorts of dependencies, it could just give you an immutable object, so a single object, and then it would run wherever I needed it to run. So Docker, as a technology, was really a container wrapper. Nowadays, we're talking containers much more than Docker, because the company Docker then put itself into a competitive landscape with a whole bunch of other people, including Kubernetes. And so as Docker went up the stack and tried to do container orchestration or container scheduling with their own suite of tools, other companies came in and tried to do the same thing. So Kubernetes, Mesos, Rancher, Cloud Foundry to an extent. There's all of these technologies that provide container orchestration to some level or another. And so Docker, the company, ended up competing with its own ecosystem around Docker, the technology.
Right.
And if anything is more confusing than that, it's just name collisions are hard.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I really don't know the answer to this question, but I assume that Kubernetes is much more amenable to network function virtualization, but I don't really know. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that.
So network function virtualization, or NFV, is not particularly more amenable than Docker and Swarm and things like that. The challenge is that to virtualize the network, you have to have an interface point where you can then add network functions into that stack.
Right.
both technologies use containers and Docker at the back, and then they're dealing with the network limitations of those technologies. So Kubernetes has some interfaces that CNI, container networking interfaces, that are better or more amenable towards doing some network plugins and management. It's still a young field. There's a long way to go.
Okay. And we were talking yesterday with some folks who are analysts for open source and OpenStack both, and the information that they shared with us, or at least their impressions of where they think we're headed as OpenStackers, and was that we may be coming to the point where everybody says, okay, that we're a component of open source and maybe not such a big part of open source that we get together necessarily twice a year to celebrate our open stackiness. And I was just curious what your take on that is.
So I'm assuming you're talking about the open infrastructure work that's going on in the foundation. So the OpenStack Foundation is doing a really good job of embracing a broader mission. So the users of OpenStack are doing a lot of things beyond just what OpenStack is, right? Kubernetes is a great example.
Guys, we have some questions from the audience.
Oh, we have some
Excellent.
questions from the audience. Uh-oh, here we come.
Hello, live audience.
Oh, okay. Was there a discussion on the end of the big tent idea?
I'm not a Big Ten fan. Go ahead.
I can answer that. I think the analysts were quite happy to say that the days of open tent are over. I don't know how happy that makes everybody else, but the analysts were like, yeah, not just everything's creeping in under the edge of that tent anymore. Let's see. What up?
Kim.com?
Is that?
I don't know where Kim.com is. I thought he was still on the loose, but he might have been extradited to the U.S.
Oh, yeah. And
we have somebody saying that, yes, he's back in. So I can finish the open infrastructure thought, and then I can give people an update on what I've been doing.
Yeah.
And with Big Tent. So Big Tent was an idea to sort of expand the scope of OpenStack. As a board member, I was against the idea. I thought it created confusion in the brand. And it created confusion in the brand. There's times when being right's not that much fun. But what's happened is that within the OpenStack community, the users of OpenStack do a lot of things, right? They're using Kubernetes, they're using Terraform, they're using all sorts of other technologies, and they're trying to accomplish big problems that may or may not be a good fit for OpenStack, the code base.
Right.
And so the foundation has said, you know what, we want to take our community and have discussions around those new topic areas. And so that becomes an open infrastructure discussion, right? So everybody wants to use open source technology to solve problems, and then the question becomes, does that mean it has to be an open stack, Nova, Neutron, Glass? And the answer is no. Right.
Much to the relief of some people, right?
Right. So,
I mean, not because they're bad projects, but they're really difficult to deal with if you're just coming into OpenStack and you're not an expert.
Or they add infrastructure components that you really don't need to come in there. The idea here is that it doesn't really matter. The tech shouldn't matter as long as it's open. We can build a community around it, and so OpenStack Foundation is starting to incubate ideas and communities that are related,
right,
but not force-fitting, hopefully not force-fitting, and we're still a struggle with this, OpenStack into it. And so, to answer the question that's in the background...
Please go ahead.
So 7 years ago when OpenStack was forming, my team at Dell started a project called Crowbar. It was the first OpenStack installer. It's still in use by SUSE. Believe it or not, that's a long lifespan for technology. About 3 years ago, I left Dell with the founders of Crowbar, and we started a new project called Digital Rebar. Digital Rebar, now at version 3, actually does physical infrastructure deployment. And so we've really rethought how you manage the physical side of a data center, completely simplified it, made it very fast and streamlined, very cloud native, so like Golang, RESTful APIs, very fast automation from that perspective. And so we're really excited to sort of finally go back and say, if you're going to run physical infrastructure, we can make it simple. Right? That's always been, physical's hard, you know that.
Yeah.
Physical, booting, managing physical infrastructure is really hard. Any complexity that we add detracts from the solution. And so what we've done with Digital Rebar is we've taken all of this experience we have, turned it into something very simple, very lightweight, small enough that you could run it in the switch if you wanted, and then provision a small edge data center. And then added APIs so you can interface with like Terraform. You could run a HopOnBareMetal deployment. We have some really nice Ansible integrations, so you could run Kubernetes Ansible against our stuff and get dynamic inventory. So those types of interfaces just make it very easy to consume Metal in a whole new way.
And so, would you be? Is it part of your project to create those APIs, and then how does a consumer, for example, implement them?
So the project does expose those APIs. RackN, the company, provides additional services and integrations, support. So some of the things that we produce are RackN pieces, and they extend the workflows. We're very careful to make sure that you can use Digital Rebar full lifecycle without having RackN, having to get a RackN license. But as you get into more complex enterprise workflows and burn-in, RAID and BIOS configuration, some of the Terraform stuff, you start getting into needing RackN pieces.
And so then do you see quite a bit more interaction between you and your customer base, the more deeply users are getting into those solutions?
Right, that's exactly what happens. Very basic workflows. I need to install an operating system in Go. That we definitely don't. We don't even want to get involved with that. It should be simple. I mean, this is the mantra. It has to be simple enough for you to go. And if you're doing something that then requires you to do some burn-in or advanced coordination or scheduling, that's where we get involved in solving the harder problems.
Okay, and I'm curious, like, what do you see? What level of expertise does a company need to have in-house to be able to work with these types of solutions?
So, ideally minimal. Usually the people we're talking to have been using Cobbler, and they know how to install an network boot and operating system. But what we really want to do is have you not required to, not need that expertise, so get things that work out of the box. You don't have to know how to script things. You don't have to know, any complex, Linux network boot stuff. But so depending on how you want things to work, those become options. Okay. But yeah, simplicity is the rule rather than anything more complex. And that was if you looked at some of our previous stuff, we were much more complex than we needed to be, and we fixed that.
I have a question about Project Crowbar from the Dell days, from your Dell days.
Yep.
And we have quite a mischievous person asking about that, so I'm going to hand that back over to you.
So Crowbar, So Crowbar was a platform that we built basically using Chef. And Chef is still popular, but we've been changing to something called, it's a whole topic called immutable infrastructure. Maybe I'll get to. But Crowbar is pretty straightforward. It really was designed to bring hardware up from first boot all the way through RAID and BIOS configuration, installing OpenStack. It was really an OpenStack installer. So it was pretty opinionated. It was not very flexible, and it was hard to extend. Doesn't sound very attractive. 7 years ago, it was a miracle, right? We could actually boot machines, and then Crowbar would install the servers. Susa, who is collaborating with us on the project, would show up at the Intel used to run an OpenStack contest. How fast can you get OpenStack installed? And Susa, with using Crowbar, would win it every single year, and they got down to like a 4-minute install.
And I have a special place in my heart from the old days for SUSE because they were the first Linux distribution to use the 2.6 kernel. So yeah. And
SUSE's done really good work from those things. The thing that's really changed for us, and this is a big sea change that we see, So when we talk about running a data center, we don't think about it anymore as a data center, if that's going to sound weird. What we're really talking to people about is treating physical infrastructure as if it's a cloud. So the people that we're seeing who are successful running at scale actually use very cloud-like patterns, what I would call mutable infrastructure, in doing a physical deployment. So instead of having boot provision, configuration, and management, so like Crowbar would use Chef, and there's a whole bunch, thousands of lines of configuration scripts and steps that had to be done. The current data center practice says, I'm going to build a standard image, or I'm going to build a specialized image, I'm going to deploy that image to that server, and then when I want to change it, I don't touch that image. I reboot the server and I install an updated image. So I'm always redeploying my servers. So the idea that I have a server that runs for a month or a year is completely out of fashion from that perspective. The idea is I'm going to be constantly rebuilding my environment from scratch over and over and over again. Okay. And that way, what I've designed is I've designed this infrastructure that's very well defined, very repeatable, and then instead of trying to fix it, because you get configuration drift, I'm just going to destroy it. So it's just like in cloud, we do this, we don't even think twice. It's like, oh, I need a new machine. Get a new machine, configure it, and use it. And when I'm done, destroy it, don't patch it.
Right.
So in cloud, we're always turning systems over. That's the pattern. And we're doing that in physical now.
Okay. And I have a question about how a company like mine, HostTelecom, that puts OpenStack on bare metal, right, where our intersection is or where we need to make that intersection.
So one of the places where it'd be fun to talk, because we don't try to build OpenStack on top, is being able to use our type of workflows to improve the way you're actually interacting with your OpenStack clusters from that perspective. So because of the way we operate, you could actually replace Ironic and the way Ironic interfaces with what we do with Digital Rebar. Both are treating physical inventory as a pool, and so you could add the APIs to use Digital Rebar instead of Ironic infrastructure. And you might actually find it be faster and simpler to operate, and then more generic. So we've talked to customers who have OpenStack clusters, but not 100% of their infrastructure uses OpenStack.
Right.
So this would allow them to have a consistent baseline for all of their infrastructure and then manage it that way. Or if you had different types of, you want multiple OpenStack clusters and things like that.
Okay. And I find that really interesting, too, because a lot of the folks that we've talked to are not just using OpenStack. They've got VMware, they've got OpenStack, they've got multiple platforms in their environment. So it's really interesting. And I want to thank you so much, Rob, for joining us. And we will be checking in with you again this evening. Oh, wait. What are we introducing a new guest?
A new guest?
We do have a new guest.
That I will bid the audience.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Oh, yeah, hugs. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully we'll see you wandering around.
Definitely.
Okay.
I'm always here.
Excellent. Thanks.